Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on organizational governance, the role of policies and procedures. Our speaker today is James Graham, and I'll hand over to him in just a moment, but I'm just going to very quickly run you through some housekeeping rules just to help the webinar go smoothly. The slides that you see and also the entire recording of the webinar will be available on our SlideShare page and YouTube channel for you to look at later, and emails to both these will be sent to you in a follow-up email. Take time to complete our post-webinar survey, please, at the end. It'll pop up and it will just help us know how we're doing, how you felt about the webinar, where we could improve. We really value your feedback. As you're listening to James speaking, you can type any questions that you think of in the questions box, which you'll see at the bottom right of the control panel. And James has already set his presentation up to allocate time at the end to answer these questions. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to James now. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Sherry. And good afternoon and welcome to everybody on the webinar. So my name is James Graham. Just a little bit of background about me before we kick off. I started my career in the textiles industry in Northern Europe, firstly in international sales and then after that in national sales management, also sitting on the marketing committee. After 12 years working in those kind of roles, I moved into the field of management consultancy, working very much in the development and implementation of strategy and strategic initiatives. And I still do that, but I also now work in the area of learning and development, have a very, very strong partnership with Informa in the Middle East. I've been working globally over my career, as you can see from the little dots on the map. And my speciality involves both formulation and execution of strategy, which in turn means you have to have good policies and procedures to help take that strategy out and make it work in the organization. In fact, when I talk to senior executives, they tell me very, very often that they have to exert a lot of their control via policies and procedures because they can't stand behind everybody every day and tell them exactly what to do. In other words, they're relying on people making the right decisions because of the policy guidance. So that's a little bit about me. Let's look at the agenda for today. Well, firstly, we're going to have a look at the background and context of governance and the use of policies within governance. How does the board of directors communicate with the wishes of the owners? Now, if you're in a not-for-profit organisation or if you're in a government department, instead of the board, that would be whoever makes the equivalent decisions of a board of directors, and that would be the same type of people we're talking about. Secondly, we're going to look at some good practices in organisational and governance, in particular compliance with regulations and achieving the right balance between control and the ability to act freely. Thirdly, we're going to look at the role of policies and practices in guiding decisions at all levels in an organisation, the importance of having clear business rules in determining the choices available when implementing those policies and procedures, the role of procedures in showing how to implement policies and how they relate to business processes. So in other words, keeping things aligned and working together. Also, how to create effective policies and procedures, writing clearly, writing understandable and helpful documents that help people to make the right decisions rather than acting as barriers and confusing people. And as Sherry said at the end, there's time allocated for your questions and answers. So as Sherry said, during the webinar, if you have any ideas popping into your mind, if you want to write those into the chat as we go along, we'll be monitoring that and we'll deal with those at the end. So we're going to start off with looking at what we call the governance triangle. And John Carver is an expert in the USA. He's been working in the area of governance for many, many years. And he says governance exists in order to translate the wishes of the organization's owner into organization performance. So in other words, they have a vision, they have a mission, they have objectives to achieve. Governance is then taking those objectives and turning them into real business performance. John Carver also talks about three important aspects of governance. The first one is shareholder rights or other owner rights. In other words, the people who run the organization, own the organization, have the right to put into place governance policies that help them achieve their aims. We have transparency. Organizations need to act in a way that's transparent so people can see they're doing the right things. And thirdly, the accountability of the board or the senior executive committee, whoever owns governance. They have to set governance standards and they have to be held accountable and also hold other people accountable for living and performing by those standards and not deviating. So therefore you can probably see that there is a trade-off in the three sides of this triangle and also in terms of the performance that you generate. So that's a brief introduction to the background of the governance triangle. The next thing we're going to look at is actually how the board communicates. How does it understand the wishes of the owners of the organization? Well, there's a fairly clear line of sight. The owners talk to the board take on board the wishes of the owners. The board of directors then allocates the responsibility and accountability for delivering that to the chief executive officer. That's why the chief exec is called executive rather than strategy officer or some other term. It's about performance. And the CEO then basically communicates with the employees, sets targets through the line, through the chain of command, and people then implement that. So one of the things CEOs do is they set strategies, and the strategies that the CEO sets then need to have policies, they need procedures, also processes to guide short-term actions. And the policies generally set out the intention of what the organization wants to do, how it wants to deal with certain issues that arrive, but it keeps it at a fairly high level of abstraction with guidelines and maybe some business rules rather than absolutely step-by-step guidance. Of course, when it comes to implementing those policies, it's very important that people working in the customer-facing areas such as contact centres, reception areas, shop assistants, it's important that they have more detailed guidance of how to deal with certain situations that arise. So commonly what most organisations do is create policies and then they link them into a series of procedures that deal with the execution of the tasks to implement the policies. To give you an example of this, product returns in a shop. There will be a company policy about under what circumstances a customer can return the products. Depending on how old the product is it a refund, is it a replacement, or is it a repair? And you can imagine that this kind of policy can generate some fairly detailed procedures. So consequently, the people dealing with that will either have manually look at, or they'll have on-screen guidance with a computer system with workflow management that takes them through and asks them questions. Is the product more than 1 month old? Yes, no. Depending on what answer they get to that, it will route them to the next screen. Does the customer want a refund or a replacement? Does the customer want a repair, or does the customer want a refund? So basically all of these rules, guidelines will flow from the policy and they will come down and impact on the procedures that people use, and that will guide people through the different tasks in order to execute the tasks that they're being asked to do. So that really takes you from the wishes of the owners through the board of directors acting as the representatives of the owners to the CEO to the employees. And policies and procedures therefore become a very, very integral part of how this governance works in practice. So talking about good governance, we should also consider some of the good practices in governance. One of the most important starting places for governance is to ensure that your organisational structure is appropriate. So, for example, the chairman of an organisation will generally be dealing with strategic mid-term to long-term matters. The chief executive officer will usually be dealing with shorter-term execution, although there may be some overlap between those roles. However, if you combine those two roles, there's always a danger that the person doing both the roles doesn't balance their time, effort and judgment between the two roles. They may be too fixated on the short term, or they may be too fixated on the strategic issues when you have short-term operational matters that require attention and action. That can lead to serious business problems. So clearly this is bad news. And the structure also then, the way you structure the organisation downwards, is also something that takes some care and some good design. Another good practice is to have an ethical approach where the whole process is transparent and people are accountable for following the policies and making the right decisions. In other words, it is not acceptable for people to do things on a whim. Maybe in a shop, maybe the sales assistant doesn't like the customer, maybe they find them unpleasant or rude or just don't like them. That may be the case. It may be a very difficult customer. However, the company regards the customer as someone who needs to be managed professionally and with care, and therefore you have to follow the procedures fairly. You have to be open. It's not acceptable to forget to tell them they can have a exchange products. You have to follow that through. So ethical approach is really important. It's also important to build what's called a stakeholder-driven decision model. So in other words, when people are inventing business rules or designing other kinds of processes, the decision model that decides how you're going to handle certain situations should reflect what the stakeholders find acceptable. There's an instance this week where a major international airline have missold some first-class airfares. By the way, just to be clear, this is not an airline in the Gulf region, but they've missold some airfares, they've cancelled everybody's ticket, but before they did that, there was an opportunity to communicate and let people know what was happening. They haven't done that. They've also billed some people and haven't refunded them for these tickets that have been cancelled as of yet. So, you know, whether that is ethical, transparent and accountable, I'll leave as a judgment call to other people. But under the circumstance, you can see that that's the reason you need that kind of ethical approach. And that's why you should also have stakeholder-driven decision model to make sure you do things in the right way. There needs also to be a clear strategic management process. That makes it easier to identify the policies and procedures that need to be created or amended depending on decisions. And we should always set objectives in line with strategy, because that will harmonise the line of sight from the owners through to the employees. And finally, where reporting is involved, it's really important to have transparent, accurate and timely reporting so people know what's going on and everything is literally above the board. So moving on from the sort of setup of the governance and good practice onto the role of policies. Generally, policies help with strategic alignment. If you ever listen to lectures from Professor Michael Porter at Harvard Business School, who is an eminent professor of strategy, he will often say that strategy is there for the purpose of alignment, making sure that everybody makes decisions that fit with each other and they make the right choices, not the wrong choices. So policies help that alignment by giving people frameworks to work within in making decisions. They also provide the parameters. So for example, I mentioned earlier, when people are returning products, if they're taking a broken piece of electronic equipment back to Sheriff GG, it's very important that the shop has clear parameters about what happens under certain circumstances, what options are available, what options aren't available. That helps the customer to understand they've been treated fairly. It helps the shop assistant to do the right thing for both themselves, the company, and also the customer. Where alternative courses of action exist, policies help people to choose what to do. You know, one of my favorite airlines has a policy where if you no longer want to fly on a certain date, you can either get a partial refund, or you can put the full credit of that flight towards a new flight in the future without administration costs. Depending on what I need to do in terms of traveling, that's a very good set of alternatives to have. And because it's policy, because it's published on the organisational website as a policy, it just makes it easy for you to deal with and depend on that airline. And consequently, I spend more money with them because there's a lot more certainty than there is with some others. We also need to have business rules, and business rules are very, very important because understanding what is allowed and what isn't allowed requires fairly black and white decision making. That in turn is much easier if you have rules that tell you what's possible and what isn't possible. So for example, again, you may have a business rule if you're in the business of providing seminars such as Informa. You may allow people a certain cancellation period where up until this point you can cancel without penalty, but beyond this point you lose a deposit or part of your fee. This is the same thing with hotels. If you want to book early, you can get a very, very good room rate, but if you change your mind and cancel, you get no refund. On the other hand, if you book with a more flexible, expensive rate, you can change your mind literally up to the day of arrival and get a full refund. So these kind of rules help the employees decide how to deal with situations. They help the customers to understand what they can do, and it also makes life easier, faster, reduces risk. It means you have better consistency of decision making, which generally increases customer satisfaction, and also, as we know, customers who are satisfied recommend to other colleagues and friends. Sadly, if they're dissatisfied, they tend to tell 8 to 10 times more people than if they're satisfied. There's a lot of research available that confirms that, but we don't want bad news. We want people to feel good. Also, bad decisions could impact on profitability or create liability and litigation, or in the instance of a government, could make the government appear to be bad if people don't follow the government rules, regulations and statutory policies. So that's really why policies are important. Now what we're going to talk about now is looking a little bit more about business rules. So firstly, we have the sort of decision guide aspects where you have the alternatives. What that does really is it prevents managers or other people under pressure making bad decisions, either being very, very over generous or not generous enough in the way they treat the customer. So if you have decision guides, you're consistently going to be treating your customers in the same way. And if it's a good policy, good set of business rules, that's going to increase customer satisfaction and decrease dissatisfaction and risk. Then from a point of view of managing risks, having business rules means that you can assess the potential risks that may occur when you make decisions, and that means that you have response strategies in place, and it avoids the need to have what we call knee-jerk or very quick reactions. You're not doing things that are increasing your organisational risk profile. The third important aspect of this is empowering your employees to make decisions. By giving people clear choices with clear limits, they're able to implement and make decisions. I had an example of this a few years ago in the UK when my wife and I were moving house, and the removal company unfortunately dropped a piece of pottery onto the floor and it shattered into about 1,000 pieces. We weren't too worried about this because it had only cost us literally maybe 50, 60 dirhams. It was an inexpensive piece of pottery of no great sentimental value, but the employee who dropped it from the removal company was horrified. And he went to get the team leader, who came in with a checkbook. We were very surprised about this. Normally when removal companies break something, they ask you to fill a form out and then an insurance company settles with you later. Anyway, the driver came along. He asked us how much the pottery cost. We said it was a few dirhams, don't worry about it. He said, no, we've broken it. Let's not add to the injury by making you buy another one. Even if you don't want to buy the pottery, at least you can go and have a nice meal. We'll give you some money towards that. And we agreed a figure. He wrote the check out and gave it to us there and then. I thought that was a very good example of empowerment. So I rang his company the next day just to ask about how that worked. And it turned out that they could make a decision up to the value of £200 sterling, which is about just over 1,000 dirhams, and they could settle that there and then. And as an interesting aside from that policy, the breakage percentage had dropped significantly since they introduced that policy, because the people writing the check out felt accountable for breaking the goods, and they felt that by writing the check they could see the profitability going away from the company, and they felt accountable for that. That wasn't the intention of the scheme, but it just goes to show you how business rules and policies can make employees feel more connected to the day-to-day decisions. Finally, we look at automation of systems. If you have logical business rules, it allows you to create decision gates in the format of decision trees. So the system automation of manual processes becomes much easier and more logical. And then when you have these things automated, if you wish, you can make it workflow based, you can script the transactions, and people can then, in call centers with no knowledge of the policy, simply step through a series of screens that prompt them to ask the right questions and make the right decisions, and they can keep the customers satisfied by dealing with matters quickly there and then. So that's the importance of business rules. So what we're going to move on to next is looking at the role of procedures. So if a policy tells you what the company wants to achieve and why, the procedure is your how-to guide to walk through that policy and implement it. As I've just been explaining, that the concept of workflow helps us to automate and make these processes more efficient. It allows us to link to processes at the lowest level so that we have consistency of the way we do things, from literally policy to high-level process through to procedures. In fact, a procedure is really a description of the step-by-step execution of the lowest level of a policy. So it helps alignment, it helps us to do things in a better, more consistent manner. It also provides this narrative description. It explains how to do things. Go to this system, do this, ask the customer when they bought the product, offer this compensation package. So it makes it much easier for people to offer good service and good service recovery to their customers. Also reduces the errors by consistent and standard execution methods. That means there's less risk of doing things wrong. Also, the customers, by having consistent approaches, they basically become trained to how the way the company operates. It becomes expected, it becomes more comfortable, and it's actually a marketing tool as well as a risk management and governance tool. And finally, when you're dealing in certain areas in organisations, such as, for example, offshore drilling or onshore or nearshore drilling in the Gulf region, procedures increase safety by making sure that people do things in the certain order of execution. They switch off the power before they start to maintain equipment. These small steps have saved lives and will continue to save life in the future. So having made the case for having good policies and procedures, the next question is, how do we create them? Well, we should start off with stakeholder engagement. This is really important. we need to have support. Policies will only really work when we get people to support them. And gaining support is very much a matter of creating what we call buy-in. It's a desire for people to want to make the policy work, to want to make the procedure work. And how do we do that? Well, we engage stakeholders, we find out what we need to have a policy for, we found out the easiest way of writing procedures, and we document the right things in the right way. Generally, if a policy or procedure makes it harder for an employee to do the work they're doing, there's a tendency for them to look for a workaround to keep life simple and easier. But if we're really clever in the way we design our policies and procedures, and if we get the employees to tell us how they do the job, if we look for improvements to simplify and make life easier, then generally, if they feel they've been involved, if they understand the logic, especially if we've been able to take their suggestions on board, they're much, much likelier to support us and make it work than try and stop it working. So that's a really important step. The second step is collaboration. When we're creating policies and processes, don't create them in a vacuum, don't write them up and then launch them. Once again, that's likely to create resistance to change. Much better if you can get people at the right levels involved and have a consensual approach where you discuss what needs to be done. That usually isn't negotiable beyond explanation. The board have decided we're going to do this, but how to do it, well, that's an area where management and employees can make a contribution. And a consensus doesn't mean that everybody totally agrees with what we're doing. What it does mean is that people are happy enough that this is the best solution that we can get together, that they'll all decide to support it and work together to make it happen. And if we get collaboration, well, that's a great thing. We're much more likely to get policies that work. The next thing we need to have is access to policies and procedures, make it easy. Remove the barriers to use. I mean, if you're keeping policy and procedure documents or systems away from the people using them, they're not going to use them. This is one of the reasons still that some people use paper manuals, because if you have engineers going out on site where electricity is a problem, maybe using a laptop or a tablet to access your policies and procedures isn't a wise idea, may even be banned on site. So people still have paper books. Obviously, if you have reliable IT, tablets, laptops, desktop PCs that give people easy access by contextual search and allow people to quickly track down policies, this is marvelous. It makes it easier to use the system than not to use it, so therefore people tend to use it. So the lesson to learn here is very much use appropriate media. Again, talk to people, train them on the media so there's no fear of using it. My 90-year-old aunt got an iPad for the first time last year and now does emails on it. I was astonished. I didn't think she would do, but somebody showed her how to use it, took the fear away, and now she's even learning to use Skype. So people can use systems with the right support. Finally, have a standard format. Make it easy to do things, make it consistent. What is often known as muscle memory is actually cognitive learning, where we learn how to think, we learn patterns of behavior. If we can have a standard format so we know where to look, for example, where's the policy statement? It's always at the front. Where's the process diagram? It's always in the first appendix. That's going to make it much easier to use and follow these kind of policy documents. So in summary, policies basically help to implement the owner's wishes to make sure things are done the way they want them to be done. They guide decision making at all levels to gain more consistent and sound outcomes. They're a very good help to show how to operate processes, and in particular via workflow. And finally, business process rules standardize decisions and empower employees. All of these things together make for a more consistent experience for people who are users of the organization's services or products, whether it's private sector, public sector, or not-for-profit. And generally, they de-stress the employees as well. So we hope you've enjoyed the webinar so far. We're now moving into the area where we can take questions. So I'm just going to ask Shuri if you'll kindly get up the question page for me so I can have a look and see what you'd like me to answer. Thanks, Shuri. Okay, so the first question, thank you very much for this, is how long does it take to create a full set of policies and procedures for an organisation? Great question. It depends on the size of the organisation, the complexity of the business, or the services it provides. But I would allow probably 6 to 9 months to get a full set of policies and procedures in place in basic paper format. I'd start off at a fairly high level by asking the senior executives to spend some time, and if necessary, I'd facilitate that time to make sure that we actually understand the visions, get the right things. And then I'd bring it down, I'd make the sort of line management team responsible for developing policy statements, frameworks, make sure the board are happy with the way they're laid out. I'd then get the employees involved in giving feedback, particularly how they work with various processes and procedures today. And then after that, I'd ask people to design the process and procedures and get them signed off at the organisation. So quite a few steps, and it's going to be an iterative process. It will take a little while after you've launched the processes to tune them, make them fit together, and move on. So that would be my answer to that, 6 to 9 months. Now I have another question. Can organisations really afford not to empower employees in this day and age? The example of your house move is amazing. Well, it amazed me at the time. Yeah, I think empowerment is a source of competitive advantage. And empowerment is often misunderstood. Empowerment isn't a matter of letting people do anything. Empowerment is having very clear limits and very clear authority so that employees know that they can make decisions up to a certain point without any worry that they're going to get into trouble for making those decisions. That can only give you more satisfaction from your clients, and surely from an employee point of view as well, those employees are going to feel far happier and far more motivated if the company trusts them to interpret policies. So I think those were the two questions today that we've been asked. So thank you very much for asking that. Just finally in closing, if you like the sound of what you heard today, then I'd like to just mention a couple of events that we've got coming up at Informa that I'll be speaking at. We'd love to see you along at those if you're available. Next month, we're doing a certificate in data analysis at the Address Hotel in Dubai Marina. In November, I do our sort of foundation course in strategic thinking and planning. We'll be at the Jumeirah Emirates Towers. That's suitable for anybody who wants to understand more about strategic thinking and planning. You don't need to have any experience for that. And then finally, this not this year, but next year in July, we do run a specific 4-day program on analysing, documenting policies and procedures. And that is a very, very good program if you're going to have to analyse and document policies and procedures. So finally, please do remember, if you don't mind, to give us some feedback as you exit. We do value your feedback. In fact, a lot of our best ideas come from feedback from our participants. And finally, we appreciate your time and we appreciate you coming and attending this webinar. Hopefully see you one day, inshallah, at one of our webinars. Otherwise, let me wish you a very pleasant remaining day. And thank you again on behalf of myself and Informa for attending the webinar.